So currently we are under my favorite bridge in Rome, Ponte San Angelo and Castle San Angelo, which is the end of this bridge here. Now, I've been out shooting here during the blue hour on the other side of this bridge, creating this really unique composition of the bridge leading into the castle at blue hour. It's really beautiful. It's a nice mix with the yellow light on the castle and the beautiful blue light in the sky. And today we have this awesome cloud pattern. Now, it did start to rain now, so we've kind of taken shelter under the bridge here so we can get through this segment. I just have a couple little lessons that I want to talk about with this shot. The first thing I want to talk about here with this shot is the composition. Now, I've picked kind of a medium angle of the bridge. So the bridge fills most of the frame on the right and then leads the eye in to the castle in the background. So it's a good example of using a bridge as a strong subject to lead the eye to the castle as an alternate subject. Now, let me show you a couple different examples. If I move to the left, you can see how the bridge now isn't as impactful on the right side of the frame. So it's kind of a narrow portion. So the bridge and the castle sort of become the center of the frame and the entire subject for the center of the photograph. Here's another example if I move a little bit further to the right. If I move further to the right, now the bridge is being foreshortened even more, so it has an even greater impact on the right side of the screen as it leads into the castle. So the bridge becomes most of the subject of the photograph. Here's one more extreme example if I move almost under the bridge. Now the perspective is so crazy that the bridge basically makes up most of the frame. Now, all of these are really great shots and beautiful compositions in themselves. I decided to pick the one that I like the best, but it doesn't mean any of these wouldn't work. This just comes down to personal preference. Basically, the further away I get from the bridge, the less the bridge is going to have an impact on the frame, and the less it's going to be a leading line into the castle. If I find that sweet spot somewhere in the middle, I can use the bridge as a strong, dominant leading line directly into the castle. Now, I've picked my favorite position, and this is the one we're going to talk about in post-processing, but I have a very famous photo that I shot from the other side of the bridge, so let's take a look at that now. So it's a very similar composition, but it leads the eye from the other side. So it starts on the left of the frame and leads the eye into the other side of the castle. Another thing that you'll notice with this shot is that the lights have these crazy starbursts on it. And this was done intentionally. So the second part of this demonstration that I'm going to show is how to achieve those starbursts on city lights at night. Up until this point, we've been using aperture to drag the shutter only, but aperture can also control the amount of starburst that happens on city lights at night. The higher you go up in aperture, up to f/22, will actually increase the segments of the stars and the crisp detail around those stars and lights. Let's take a look at a few examples. I've shot this scene at a bunch of different apertures so you can see the example of how the stars become more intense as the aperture increases. Let's take a look at the first example shot at f4. Here you can see there is no starburst at all. Now let's take a look at f8. In this f8 example, you can see that we're starting to get little segments of stars on the light. Let's bring it up to f11. On this f11 version, now we're starting to get a discernible look and an actual segmented star pattern. If I go up to f16 in this shot, now it's becoming crystal clear and very sharp and pronounced. The last one I want to show you is a shot at f22. You can see that the starburst is extremely detailed here. So if you want to get the maximum starburst effect, definitely go up to f22. Now, I picked my favorite spot for this shot, which is sort of a medium composition that we're going to work on, and I also picked f8. The reason I picked f8 was because I like the subtle star effect look. The second reason I picked f8 was because I didn't want the shutter speed to take too long. Part of what attracted me to the scene tonight were the details in the clouds. If I would have gone up to f22 for this shot, the shutter speed would have been so long that it would have streaked the clouds. And if it streaked the clouds, I would have lost all that detail. So let me show you an example of what the streaky clouds would look like as opposed to all the detail in the clouds. So in this shot, you can see it's still very beautiful, but it has a completely different feeling. While the other one locked in all of those details in the clouds and made that part of the composition, this shot has streaky clouds. So it's still beautiful, but it's a completely different look. So it's going to be up to you to decide what type of stars you want and how streaky you want the clouds to be. Keep in mind that none of these are the wrong answer. It just comes down to style choice. Let's take a look at my famous shot of this location one more time. Now, I shot the main scene at f8 and I shot an additional exposure at f22, and I took those stars from the f22 exposure and put them into the scene. The reason being is I wanted to retain, once again, that high detail in the clouds, but I still wanted to get those starbursts. So that's always another option too. You can freeze everything in motion in the clouds with your prime aperture, whatever you want, f8, f11, whatever you feel comfortable with the time of the shutter and how everything looks. And you can always shoot an additional exposure for those other elements like the starburst. You could shoot different exposures at different f-stops and composite your favorite starbursts in. Again, this just takes a little bit of planning and preparation and kind of having a vision and knowing exactly what you're going to want in your final shot. Now, all of these elements that we've talked about, the starburst, long exposure streaky clouds, as opposed to just freezing the clouds in their place and maintaining sharpness, this is not just luck. This is a matter of deciding what you want for your shot and executing it. So this shot is pretty straightforward. There's a perfect blend of beautiful natural light in the sky, nice crisp blues and details in the clouds, and also really beautiful yellows and warm tones in the foreground. So let's take this into post-processing and put it all together. Welcome back to the post-processing studio, everybody. This session is all about Ponte St. Angelo. So Bridge St. Angelo leads into Castle St. Angelo. We're actually standing underneath the bridge or in varying positions next to being underneath it. So we examined in the video portion what it looks like when we get in different positions, how that bridge is foreshortened, and how the leading lines change when we get closer to the bridge. The other thing that we did is we looked at the effects of higher apertures on lights and how that impacts the starburst effect, and how choosing the right aperture and choosing the right angle is all stuff that you carefully calculate in order to get the right type of scene and the exact shot that you want for your portfolio. For this shot, we're actually going to combine multiple exposures together using luminosity masking. We're going to do some perspective adjusted cloning that's going to allow us to replace a portion of the bridge that's actually missing because of the dock, so that's going to be a little complex. After that, we're going to add some details, only where we want the details, so we're going to keep the water nice and soft and add rich details to the bridge. So let's get started. Here we are again in Capture One. This is the file that I'm going to work with. I've brought in two exposures. I brought in the exposure 0 and the -1 exposure so that we can blend these together. But let's take a look at this. Here's some varying degrees of this. And I know we already took a look at this in the video section, but you can see the way that the one that I selected here on the right, you can see that the bridge has a bigger impact on the scene than the one a little bit further to the left. You can see that it leads the eye in. This is also a beautiful shot. I kind of like the way that the bridge is extremely foreshortened here. A more extreme example of that foreshortening would be getting under the bridge, and you can see here, this is just a completely different shot altogether. It's more of a, crazy distortion shot. It's something that's definitely a little bit more unique and takes advantage of that wide angle. So I'm going to go split the difference and pick the medium view and the bridge. You can also see that I was shooting at f11. We learned that f11 gives really nice starbursts. So why do I have two here? Well, let's examine the EXIF data a little bit more. The 10mm is basically 15mm in APS-C mode when we talk about 35mm format. ISO 200, 8-second exposure. So you can see that this is an 8-second exposure. I get all the waters crystal clear and sharp. It's awesome. But if I go to this exposure, it's underexposed, 3.2 seconds. It's a little ripply here, not quite as good. Actually, it's very close to the same. The water was very calm. But here's the deal. Take a look at the starbursts. See how they're really light and unpronounced? With the actual exposure here in the sky, they're very sharp. I have very good detailed starbursts, so I want to maintain that. So what I'm going to do is use this as my base layer, but I have a problem. And that problem is these blown out values on the castle. So let's go ahead and see first if we can correct those blown out values by adjusting for the highlights. And you can see we can start to adjust that. We can start to get rid of those blown out values. But still, we're missing some data, some very important color data that's there. We could even roll the exposure down a little bit and try to get them back, but that's really not going to do the trick. What we're going to have to do is balance this. Let's go ahead and balance this exposure, and that's by pulling the shadows up just a little bit, balancing this so I don't have too much that's actually clipped. Go ahead and correcting for the highlights a little bit, but let's take a look at the underexposed file. The underexposed file, look at the bridge there, and you can see that very little is actually destroyed, and if I recover the highlights, you can see that I get even more of it back. Now remember, in raw processing, you can't recover the highlights as much, but you can always recover the shadows. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna go ahead and load this into Photoshop first, and then we're gonna bring this in just for the highlights. But before we do that, we're gonna go ahead and neutralize the shadows so they're very similar throughout. And here you go, the shadows are very similar. Highlights are much better, much cleaner. That's exactly what I want to see. So let's go ahead and get this into Photoshop first. And I'll do that by clicking here, exporting a variant. Just like last time, I already have my original RAW, so I'm going to bring this one, the adjusted RAW, on top of the original RAW. I'm going to name it Adjusted Shadows. Go back to the annoying bouncing notification of Capture One. I'm going to take this, do the same thing, get this into Photoshop as well. Bring this one in too. And paste it right on top here. So that looks pretty good. Now I do like the way that the sky looks. I actually really like the way that the sky looks here. So what I'm actually going to do, first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to take this and name it Adjusted Raw Shadows. So there we go. So I have my base layer that I really like here, and now I have my adjusted raw for the shadows. So here's what I want to do. I want to use this as my base layer, and I want the shadows to basically line up here, but I'm really concerned about getting these highlights to work. So before, one way I could do it is just start to brush this area in, but what I want to do is similar to what we've been doing with luminosity masks, is I want to create my own custom luminosity mask. So I know that I'm really only trying to do surgery here on the highlights, so just like we've done before, I'm going to go to the channels, and I'm going to load RGB as a selection. I'm going to create a folder and apply the mask, so now I have the highlights selected here. Very simple, I have the highlights. So I'm going to go ahead and say Luma Highlights. Easy. We're going to take the adjusted raw shadows, put that in here, and you can see that already this is starting to look great, but it's overlaying some stuff on the sky. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and black out a mask on this layer, and I'm basically just going to zoom in and paint this selectively. So I'm going to zoom in right here on the castle, and I'm going to brush this in very simply, and actually I can use basically any percentage opacity that I want. And what I'm going to be able to do is just brush all of this back in. So it may seem minor, but these are the small little tweaks that we're going to have to deal with architectural photography all the time. You can see even around these lights. Check this out. See this light here? I can actually pull that down a little bit, soften it, get some of the texture back around it. You can see that that narrows it out. If I toggle this on and off, after I do a little bit more surgery here, you can see that now I'm starting to fix those areas of extreme highlight and actually basically paint it in custom. Here's where it gets really cool. See these lights? If I do the same thing around these lights, you can see that I can actually pull the light in a little bit more. If I do this, I can actually change it and pull the light in just a little bit more. So it basically will pull the star shape in around the globe of the light. This doesn't work everywhere. It works areas where we have highlights, but there are some problems. Like here where it's bursting through, if I start to paint that, you can see I'm getting some problems. So it works some places, but it actually doesn't work anywhere. But you can see it works well here. I'm actually getting more detail on those lights. So it actually pulls it in and makes it a smaller globe. So again, anywhere that I have problems, anywhere that I want to try to fix some of these highlights, I can just go ahead and paint them in. Very casually paint these in. It's very easy. Very, very easy. Since everything's controlled by that luminosity mask, and it's not a difficult luminosity mask to make, just one click, and you're good to go. So all this kind of stuff here too, I can just go ahead and fix, fix, fix highlights. Once I'm happy with that, we'll take a look at the result. So we have before and after, and we've been able to fix those highlights. So that was a pretty easy blend. Let's go ahead and call it a blend. We're going to put it inside of a folder and call it a blend. But what's the biggest thing that sticks out about this photo? In my opinion, it's all of this down here. I'm going to lasso around it. Check this out. That's a deal breaker for me, and this makes it less of a portfolio piece. We have a tree sticking out. We have part of the dock. So our only options are either to, one, crop this out. That means we have to crop closer to this area or crop part of the bridge, or we have to spend some time cloning it out. And remember, last time we were doing extensive cloning, it was for a piece of gear that they were restoring the forum with. It was something that was unnatural, that shouldn't have been there. Well, this kind of takes the viewer out as well. But we have a problem. This is in perspective. So if I start to clone, let's say, this statue over this statue, it's much smaller. So we're going to have to use a different tool to be able to make this happen. Before we can access that tool, we have to get all of this on a new layer. So Shift Option, Command E, and we have a brand new layer. So what I'm going to actually use, I'm going to introduce a brand new tool, and I'm going to introduce what's called the Vanishing Point tool. So up here under Filter, I'm going to select Vanishing Point. Once Vanishing Point is loaded, the first thing I have to do is draw my perspective lines. I'm going to do that by drawing this bounding box. And with this bounding box, I'm going to be able to create a perspective. And once I click, it's going to create a grid. So I may need to zoom out a little bit because what I'm trying to do is follow the edges of this bridge the best that I can. And sometimes when you're working, the grid will disappear. It's a little buggy. It depends on your system and what kind of graphics card you have. Sometimes it works perfectly, sometimes it doesn't. The best thing that you can do, though, is just to line up everything the best you can by following these edges so that you can create accurate perspective. And really, it's going to be important for me to create the most accurate perspective along the bottom here. So I'm really going to do my best to make sure that that's exactly the way I want it. Once this is drawn, I can go ahead and start to use the clone stamp, or I can draw my own selection here. And let's just say that I want to use part of this image. I basically want to recreate this part. So what I want to do is select this part. With that part selected, what I can do is Option drag to create a floating selection. So basically, if I hold Option, I can drag, and now it's going to create a floating selection right on top. And you can see as I start to add this, it's going to create and put that exactly where I need it. So it's going to work really well. And it's basically just going to recreate this portion of the image. And you can see that it almost actually fits perfectly where it's supposed to. And even if I look, now unfortunately I can't change the opacity of this, but it's going to come in handy once I'm able to start cloning in. So let's just go ahead and get this exactly where we want it. That looks pretty good. And honestly, just with this, I'm going to say, okay. This may look a little bit funny at first, and it does look a little bit funny at first. But let's go ahead and full screen here so that I can zoom right in on it. You can see that I have this new layer here, but I have a new ability to be able to paint in these other objects. So what I'm going to do now is black this layer out. This is going to be a little different than our other procedure, and I'm going to start painting in the areas that I didn't have before. So basically, to recreate part of the bottom of this bridge here, all I'm going to do is start to paint it in. And you can see that I can start to paint this in. Well, it may look a little bit funny at first. That's because it will look a little bit funny. We're going to have to do a little bit to color correct it. But for the most part, it clones the bridge right back in where it's supposed to be. And again, I can take some of it out, some of it in, and then we'll go ahead and paint in some of the difference here. So this is pretty cool because it allows me to just go in and get rid of some of that area while keeping and maintaining some of the detail. So again, it's not always perfect, but it works pretty well. So that it was able to give us this little bit. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to leave this alone for a minute because I was able to get the rest of the bridge in perspective. And now I'm going to create a new layer on top of that I can clone above. Well, this is where it gets actually quite fun. Because what I want to do is I want to first recreate this texture inside of here, and then I want to go and create this texture inside of here. So right now, everything that I've been doing with the clone stamp has relied on following edges. But if I follow edges here, you can see that those edges don't wrap around. So what I'm going to do is create selections for myself. And instead of using the selection tool, I'm actually going to use the Bezier pen tool. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and click here, and I'm going to click and drag here, and I'm going to create my own custom curve for this to follow. If you guys aren't familiar with using the Bezier tool, it's a really nice tool. It actually gives you the ability to create these nice custom curves, and you can move them around. And if I create that, let's just say that I want to clone in this water here. Well, I can go ahead and just create a selection like this. And then once I have that, I can actually click up here and turn it into a selection. And I can also give it a feather. In this case, I'll give it a 1 pixel feather. Now, if I go S for the clone stamp, I can actually start to paint in areas here. Like if I paint here, I can start to paint this out and maintain that edge that I've created, which is really powerful actually. So I'm going to pick something that's a little bit heavier, and I'm just going to start to paint all this grass out here. And I'm going to maintain that edge, the edge of the bridge there. So we'll just go ahead and paint some of this out. Have to be really careful. Some of the content aware might work here too, but I'll just go ahead and, like this area here, which didn't exist, a lot of this is just water, so it's okay. The cool thing is, what I can do is after that's done, I can invert this selection. Command-Shift-I. Now it's going to select everything but that area. That means that I can go in here and start painting in the same texture here. So I can grab some of this color, paint in. And what's cool about this is just color. We can agree that this is just color. From the clone stamp, I can swap to the brush. I can select any color that I want here, and I can pick something that's very, very minor on the flow with brush. Sometimes like 5% is all that you need, and you can see that I can actually just start brushing in color now, right over top of here. So now color, I'll change it to 10%. Color is going to allow me to just paint this out. I don't need to clone at all because this basically just is color. Color, color. Very, very easy. So I can go ahead and paint that. The nice thing is too that this is basically a reflection. So if I grab different colors here, I can actually take some of this color, this brown color, and I can start to bring this brown color back in here so it looks a little bit different. There's a little bit more texture, this lighter color right here. I can brush some of that back in just so it gives it some varying color with the reflection. After I do that, I can always click back to the clone stamp and basically just start cleaning all this up. All of this junk, basically, that we have here. All of these problems that we have in the reflection. Well, just like last time, we're not doing anything that's crazy. We're not doing anything like removing a tractor trailer or anything like that. But again, these are basically just reflections. So if they're reflections, then you can get away with a lot because nobody really knows how accurate the reflections already are. So that looks pretty good. We have to get rid of some more of this. So what I'm going to do is create another Bezier selection. Command-D will deselect what we have. And what I'm going to do is just go ahead and use that pen tool again to get this edge. It's just easier this way than clicking a bunch of times. And I'll do the same thing around here. Load it as a selection, feather it by 1, and again, we'll just go ahead and use the brush tool. Brush tool again, select gray. Let's go ahead and paint this out here. Pretty easy. Pretty easy to just paint that out. Now here what I'm going to do is go ahead and deselect it a little bit. We have some problems here. I'll address that in a minute. Now what I'm going to do is actually use the brush tool again, and I'm going to just actually grab some of this blue, and I'm going to go ahead and paint in that blue. Soften up this edge right here. So just paint in some blue for the reflection. And then we end up with basically a reflection that looks pretty good. Next thing I probably want to do is take these layers, but what I'm going to actually do first, all I really needed was that one piece of this layer. So I'm going to grab a marquee selection here, and I do not want the rest of this layer, so I'm going to invert that selection and delete it so I can just focus on this little bit. I don't need that whole layer to be there, just the patch of that layer. So now I'm going to kind of take a look and see where I need to clean some stuff up here. At this point, it's probably easier to merge these things together into one. And I will apply the mask that I had, and now I'll do a little bit more brushing just to even out some of this color here. So even out some of this color here. And this is kind of cool too. For this layer here, I'm actually going to select the blur tool, and I'm actually going to blur that edge, this edge here, just a little bit. And you know what, before I do that, let me zoom in even more, because the blur tool is nice. So I created these edges here, but now I can go in and I can soften them. So you can see I can soften that edge just by painting over it. So if I thought it was a little bit too harsh, this is a little bit too harsh, I can just go ahead and blend it out. Blend it out. It's pretty easy because it's a reflection. It should be pretty soft. This little bit that I forgot here, no problem at all. We can just basically get rid of it real easily. No problem. No problem at all. Something else there. one last thing. I know this takes a little bit of time, but that's already starting to look pretty good. There's our recreated reflection. Next thing that I want to do while we're at it, we're on this layer, we're going to call this patch layer. And I'm going to go ahead and address any of the other issues that we have. So if we have, you know, sticks in the water, all this other kind of stuff, we might as well take care of them. Might as well get rid of them. No reason for them to be there. It's all distracting elements. Obviously, there's going to be some things that are in here. Like this, for example, I don't mind so much. I think that makes it look more like a reflection, these little streaks. This is kind of a deal breaker for me. I'm not sure what it is. Other things back here, these little, I mean, it's dirty. The Tiber River is definitely a dirty river. If you are shooting here, do your best to not fall in. That's my advice to you. It's horrifying when I see people fishing here because I'm horrified at the fact that they might actually eat the fish. So Rome is very wonderful, but it can also be a little bit dirty too. So we'll get rid of some of this. What's this? This is I have no idea what this is. It's a fishing line, it's something. Let's go ahead and get rid of it. I just want to go ahead and get rid of all of these things before I move on. It's very easy too, especially in reflections. We can basically just make it up as we go along. Nobody really knows whether or not it's supposed to be there in the reflection, and nobody's really paying attention to it. Here might be a little bit more difficult. We might need to actually follow rock edges, different things like that. Here, more edges. Stuff here in the trees, super easy. All you do is just grab a little bit of the trees here and cover it up. Very simple, very simple. This as well. Grab a line here, see where the brick ends, start anywhere where that line continues, follow it all the way up. Very, very easy. Same thing here, edges, find the edge, bring it all the way down. Not too bad. While we're on it, we might as well get rid of the people too. You can see there are people up here. And sorry people, we're gonna get rid of you too. We like to get rid of everybody. It's not that we hate you, it's just that you have no business being between this little fence here. Again, this is really easy because perspective is pretty much the same. You can see at the end there it's not the same. That's okay. I can go ahead and fix it. No problem at all. Anybody else? Anybody else? Yep, here's a few other people here. Let's just go ahead and replace this. Nobody will ever notice there if I move all this and replace it with another edge. Nobody knows, then there's no harm done. Easy. Here on the top, easy. Really easy. That takes care of those people there. Let's go in the background. This is so easy, actually. This is the easiest thing you can do. Anytime there are edges, you just find an edge that's similar, paint them out of existence. Easy here. Same thing. Bye-bye. Sorry, tourists. You're not there. And it's not that they shouldn't be there. I mean, you can leave people in. It's just that longer exposures leave blurry people, and I can't stand blurry people. I like them to either just be there or to not be there. Lately, I've kind of elected to just get rid of them. And again, this is a really quick thing that you can do just to clean up shadows. Anybody here, like these people over the trees, very distracting. Very distracting. I screwed that up, but I'll go ahead and fix it. Very, very, very easy. So that about takes care of all of the cleanup, unless you see any garbage or anything else down there that needs to be removed. So we'll go ahead and take a look at our final clean and blended result. Now that that's finished, we'll add it to the final blend. And that looks pretty good. I'm just going to save while I go ahead and move on to the next step. I want to get this into Color Effects Pro. I'm just going to do a few quick things in Color Effects Pro before we talk about selective sharpening. So let's do that hotkey again to duplicate everything. Shift, Option, Command, E. We can go to Filter again, Nick Collection, Color Effects Pro. Color Effects Pro, I just want to add a little bit. I want to pull some of that contrast back that I lost by nearly blowing out these whites here. I don't want to go too much. I just want to get some of the detail back in the sky. Just a little bit. If I do the color cast correction, you can see it's horribly, horribly wrong. So we're just going to leave that as is. What we're going to do though is notice when I do the color cast, notice how the bridge turns yellow. The reason it's doing that is because it's detecting that there is too much magenta in this bridge. We have strong yellow, blue, and we actually have magenta cast in this bridge, which I think is wrong. You can see it heavily here. So what we're actually going to do is add something new called a white neutralizer. And I'm going to first select the area that I want to neutralize, which is what I said, that bridge, the color I want to mitigate. And you can see automatically it pulls all the color out of that, leaves our blues and yellows intact. What does that tell you? There was plenty of magenta in this bridge after all. Well, I don't really want to do that. And there are two options here. There's an adjust whole image and a neutralize white. Neutralize white will make it desaturated. Adjust whole image will flood it with its own complementary color. That's why the other slider in Pro Contrast was turning it green. It's trying to fix it. So what we can do is add a little bit of this, flood it with color, and also neutralize it just a little bit. And now we can go from a before to an after. We can find a happy medium for a neutralize, basically. And while everything's neutralized, we can go ahead and lock it in. So with the bridge, let's go ahead and lock in and just neutralize the color on the bridge. I don't want any fall through. I don't want to neutralize too much, and I want a little bit neutralized here. I'm not trying to pull saturation out so much. I'm just trying to sort of add some variation in the color. And this is a big problem in Rome. It actually drives a lot of people crazy. Lee Morris from F-Stoppers, it drives him crazy. Everything's yellow, everything's lit yellow. Well, that's just kind of the way that Rome is an ancient city. So there's not a whole lot that we can really do about that. But what we can do is mitigate some of the problems. So here in the bridge, you can see that we're actually getting rid of some of that obnoxious color. So if I neutralize it here, you can see we have it selected so well. We want some warmth, but we want to remove it a little bit just so it doesn't look too unnatural. It also pops the colors against the sky and against everything else. So that works pretty well. But speaking of the sky, let's go ahead and kick those values up in the sky a little bit. Yet let's use a Pro Contrast, actually. We'll use a Pro Contrast again. Or actually, sorry, not a Pro Contrast. I wanted to use a tonal contrast. So we use a tonal contrast. We will not leave it to default because that looks like a 1999 HDR image. We don't want to do that. So we're just going to say midtones, just a little bit, shadows, just a little bit. See how that's actually popping up the reflection as well? I like that. So let's go ahead and add this just to the sky. Just to the sky. Create some of that detail. I'm a big fan of details. Just love details. But I don't want to add them in the bridge, really. I just don't want them on the castle. I don't want too much contrast. I want that to stay pretty much the same. But this is a good example of where you can add detail to reflections where it's not adding sharpness. So again, we have our tonal contrast, popping that sky out a little bit. I may need to tone this down to about 12. I don't want any saturation. And we'll just say, you know what, 12, 12 is fine. All of this is good. Let's apply it. Well, that's starting to look pretty nice. So we have the Color Effects Pro. We have our redundant layer that we can get rid of. I'll go ahead and do that just by dragging it to the trash can. So we have our CEP details. That looks pretty good. Now I want to do a couple different things. I want to use a high pass filter. So I've gotten all of these really cool details back. In fact, you know what? I think it's a little bit too much. Sometimes that happens. So let's just go ahead and blend it down with itself just about to 70 or 80%. So I'm just going to blend that back down. Rename it CEP contrast. Contrast cocktail. We'll go ahead and save the result here. Okay, good, before and after. The next thing that I want to do is I want to add a high pass filter, but just to the bridge. So we know the steps for that. So we know that we can do a duplication here. We can go to filter, other, high pass, and since this is an X-T1 16 megapixel, set that radius to 2 and set it to overlay. Here's the problem. There are a lot of edges. Watch what it does to the sky. Lots of noise, lots of extra noise. Love what it does to this area. Love what it does to the bridge. Especially love what it does around here. You can see that it adds like this chiseled detail. In fact, it's really intense. 2 is very, very intense. But what if I want it in these little pieces here? I don't want it in the sky, I don't want it in the reflection. What can I do? Well, one step is to mask it, but maybe there's a way that we can create a channel selection to fix it for us. So let's go ahead and look at the channels again. Well, look at green, red, and blue is almost selected. Let's duplicate blue. We've done this before. So what I'm going to do is clamp the values. You can see if I wanted to select the bridge right now, the sky would be selected. If I invert it, easier to understand. So what I'm actually just going to do is clamp this a little bit here. Clamp it until all that sky is gone, and then I'm going to clamp it here until I have most of the bridge. Now this is going to be a very harsh mask, but that's okay. This is the worst that I've ever clamped a mask, but I'm going to show you guys how to fix it. After I clamp it, I'm going to go ahead and clean it up. What I mean by clean up, I mean we need to make this area white. Who cares about that tree? Here too, we don't have to worry about the lights, right? The lights aren't important. We're not trying to make those sharp. We're trying to make this thing sharp. That'll probably be okay. Here, same thing. I'm just going to clean this whole thing up just so it makes more sense right now. That's all I'm doing, cleaning this whole thing up. This becomes our mask. This is where everything lives inside of. So right now it's not exactly what I want. Look at these edges. These basically follow the rough edges. Don't worry about little gray areas here. What I'm going to do is load this as a selection. I'm going to do something that I haven't done before. Under layers, I don't want this to go edge to edge. I want it to be just inside the edge. Because if I turn on this layer, you can see that I get this halo. I don't want that halo. So what I'm going to do actually is this little trick. I'm going to go up to select, and I'm going to modify, contract the pixels. I'm going to contract by 2 pixels. And this is going to shrink everything in. After I contract by 2 pixels, I'm going to go back to select, modify, and I'm going to feather by 1 pixel. And now I'm going to apply it here. And you can see that I'm going to get all that sharpness and no halos. The reason is because I basically pulled in from the edge of that selection, I contracted 2 pixels, softened the edge, and now I have a perfect selection of all of these details. So all of that stuff will pop against the bridge and I'll get no halos at all. It's a really easy way that you can isolate something. So now you have perfect sharpness and you have perfect softness in the sky, even though we probably could go through and add another layer. In fact, we'll do that last for the softness of the sky based on a reverse mask of this, since we know that that worked. The next thing that I want to do, we'll go ahead and talk about sharpness in the bridge and sharpness in the water. I don't want it in the water, so let's show our mask. You can see that that looks wonderful. Actually, let's go ahead and brush out the rest of it. Nothing here, nothing here, nothing here, nothing here. I do not want any accidental sharpness anywhere where there shouldn't be sharpness. There we go. So we have selective sharpening. I may even want to, you know what? Let's take a little bit out of the background here, a little bit off the castle. Let's lead the eye into sharpness just so we can fade it down just a little bit. Really, really simple way to do this. And with that applied, we have our high pass 2px. On the same train of thought before, let me just, sometimes we miss little areas here. I get a little carried away, not as thorough as I should be there on certain things. Let's just clean up that mask since I spent that long to make it. Before we do the final touches on this, let's go ahead and mitigate some of the sky noise here. And you can see that there's not much. But let's pretend that we're going to send this to print. We've spent a lot of time working on it. So we're going to go back to this color effects. And instead, last time we used a different set of plugins. We're going to stick with Nik, and we're going to use Nik Define. So Nik Collection comes with Color Effects Pro. It comes with HDR Effects Pro. If you want to try blending multiple exposures, Sharpener, which we'll use at a later time, Silver Effects, which is great. But it also comes with Define. Define's really nice because it basically works to just analyze and get rid of the noise in the sky. By default, it works pretty well, but what I'm going to do is use a manual adjustment, and I'm going to select an area of heavy noise, usually in the corner of the image, and say measure noise. I say measure noise. If I drag this back and forth, you can see it gets rid of nearly all the noise in the sky, gets this print ready, and I'll apply the result. Cool. So now we have a soft result. So noise reduction. Go back to the channels. Remember this layer that I created? What would happen if I inverted it? Well, it's essentially a sky selection. So let's go ahead and use that. I'll go ahead and select it. It's all the way around the edges. We'll go back to the layers. I won't do anything to this, but I'll go ahead and apply it to the noise reduction layer. So now you can see that here We have noise reduction, basically just follows those edges. And you can see right around the angel here, you can see that that gets softer. It softens that detail out, but does not hurt any of the details in the foreground. In fact, I've amplified the details in the foreground, softened the details in the background, and now, in a similar fashion, I'm going to go ahead and soften any noise that might be in the water, showing the mask, and I'm going to brush this in again, just like I did before. We'll go ahead and brush it in. We use a heavy-handed brush this time. That's what I like about using the Wacom and the stylus. I can just brush all this in selectively. Very, very easy. So we have a perfect mask for our high-pass filter, perfect mask for our noise reduction. Next thing I want to do is just address something in this image. There was something, if we go back here inside of Capture One, that I really like this image, but I kind of like the blue in the sky here. So how can I get this blue back to a blue like this? Well, it's actually pretty easy. We don't have to use a plugin. What we can do is use an adjustment layer. And we can use an adjustment layer called Selective Color. Selective Color allows us to pick any color channel, in this case the blues, and we can add C, M, Y, and K. K is black. It's different than what we've been doing before. Everything in curves has been RGB. RGB is additive color. This is subtractive color. It's a little bit different. Rather than getting into it, I can just show you that in the blues, if I start to add black, you can see that I can actually add black in the blue channel. So I can actually just pull the values down a little bit, make that a little bit darker. And I can actually add colors. So cyan would make it a little bit more vibrant. Taking it out would make it a little bit more purple. You can see that I can shift the colors, the magenta, take the magenta out, really all these things. Now I find with my blues that black usually works pretty well. But if I remove a little bit of yellow, you can see it becomes a little bit more saturated. If I add a little bit of yellow, it takes the saturation away. Because again, warm against cool, these complementary colors actually work against each other. So basically what I can do is darken it to the way that I want it and mitigate some of the saturation. And we can look before and after. And I'm just able to pull some of that vibrance of that blue back. Last thing that I'm going to go is just to unify here with either brightness and contrast or my own custom curves. I like to do my brightness and contrast with curves. Just by, I can actually select, create a point and use the arrow keys to nudge. You can do the same thing here and use the arrow keys to nudge, just to create some extra contrast here. Last thing, maybe, you know what? Let's add some more contrast. One more. This time, instead of using curves, doing it the curves way, we'll just use brightness and contrast, because sometimes they're interchangeable. I'll say contrast here, just some contrast. I just want this to be in the water, so what I'll do is go ahead and mask it. So we have white contrast in the water to here. So with these two contrast layers, I get overall global contrast, and I get the extra contrast. And if I add all these together here, I get that darker sky. So my selective color, I can actually roll down just a hair to offset what I did with the contrast. And that looks pretty good overall. All right, so it's time, once again, to take a look at our before and after. So here's the after. I've added a lot of detail to the sky, some punch to the bridge. We've cleaned the reflections. We've gotten rid of all these problems here and created our own custom reflection. Now it's time to take a look at the original. So there's our original. Doesn't look a whole lot different this time, but if we look at the after, we've been able to clean it up, add interest in these other areas, and create something that is definitely a little bit more cool and more portfolio worthy than the original file. We've done that with some really simple luminosity masking. We've done that with some more channel selections. We've been able to isolate objects so that we have a perfectly sharp foreground, perfectly soft background. So this not only is better than the original, more crisp and sharp, but it's actually almost print ready. So you could print this, hang it on your wall, and it would look pretty good. Thanks guys for watching. That wraps it up for Under the Bridge, under Ponte San Angelo. I'll see you guys next time.